Representative Ilhan Omar just told Vice President J.D. Vance that he pulled up the ladder on every refugee in America, and his response resulted in 10 seconds of absolute, undeniable silence. She said this directly to the face of a man who grew up in a house where the ladder was a fire escape from an illicit substance lab. He was a man who climbed it anyway, one rung at a time, with bloody hands and absolutely no safety net. She called him a hypocrite. He responded by asking her about the last time she ever said thank you. On May 22, 2025, the floor of the United States Senate hosted a special joint session on immigration reform. This brought the unusual sight of House members addressing the Senate chamber. This is a rare occurrence, but it is constitutionally permitted for matters requiring bicameral deliberation. Vice President J.D. Vance presided from the chair, which is the way every vice president has done since the nation's founding. They are present, mostly silent, constitutionally required to be there, but not expected to speak. Ilhan Omar, the representative from Minnesota's 5th District, had been invited to present the House Progressive Caucus position. She stood at the podium, her headscarf perfectly arranged, and her voice amplified through the Senate's oak-paneled chamber. Instead of addressing immigration policy, she turned to face the presiding officer's chair. She looked directly at J.D. Vance, and she aimed. You are about to hear how the Vice President of the United States answered an accusation with a question so simple and so human that the woman who attacked him could not find a single word to say for 10 full seconds. Vice President Vance, Omar said his name, the way a prosecutor says a defendant's name. It was flat, loaded, and already convicted. The Senate chamber shifted. Senators who had been checking their phones looked up, and aides who had been whispering immediately stopped. The protocol for a House member addressing the Senate is incredibly clear. You address the body, not the chair. You say, Mr. President or Madame President, utilizing the institutional title. You do not look up at the presiding officer and say his name, and you especially do not say it like that. Vice President Vance, you are the poster child for pulling up the ladder. Omar's voice carried the practiced rhythm of 1,000 House floor speeches. It was measured, cadenced, and perfectly designed to make the evening news in 8-second clips. You escaped poverty. Congratulations. And your first act was to slam the door on every refugee, every immigrant, every person trying to do exactly what you did, she stated. She gripped the podium with both hands. This was not because she was nervous, as Omar was never nervous at podiums. She gripped it because it made her knuckles visible, and visible knuckles meant visible conviction. That visible conviction played incredibly well on the 6 cameras pointed directly at her. You wrote a book about the American dream, a bestseller that made you famous and made you rich, she continued. Then you got elected and made it harder for everyone else to live that dream. You are a hypocrite in a suit, Mr. Vice President, a man who benefited from every safety net in America and then voted to cut them all. She paused. The Senate chamber held the particular silence of 100 people who all know that a line is about to be crossed, and none of them can stop it. And let's be honest about what you really are, Omar added, her chin lifting. It was the same chin that had faced down critical news panels, congressional censure votes, and severe threats to her safety. It was a chin that never dropped. You didn't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You married into Yale. You took Peter Thiel's money. You serve a president who called your people hillbillies before he needed their votes, she declared, letting the words sit in the room. You're not a champion of the working class. You're a prop with a sad backstory. The chamber exhaled. It was not a gasp, but more like the sound a room makes when someone says the thing that everyone knew was coming, but absolutely no one thought would actually come on the presiding officer's day. J.D. Vance sat still. It was not the stillness of a man who was stunned, nor the stillness of a man calculating a response. It was the deep stillness of a man from Middletown, Ohio, who had heard much worse from his own mother on her worst nights. Those were nights when the prescription medications were running low, and the words were running incredibly hot. It was the stillness of a 13-year-old boy who learned that the loudest person in the room is almost never the strongest person. He did not shift in his chair. He did not adjust his tie, and he did not reach for his water. He just looked at Omar with an expression that the C-SPAN camera 3 caught in perfect focus. It was not anger, not amusement, and not contempt. It was recognition. It was the quiet recognition of a man who had seen this exact play before. It was the grievance play, the "you were one of them now" play. It is the play that says the only authentic poor person is one who never leaves poverty. He waited until she was completely finished. Then, he waited 3 more seconds after that. He did this not for drama, but because rushing a response is the habit of people who do not trust their own words. Vance trusted his words the way he trusted the Marines who trained him completely. Then, the Vice President of the United States leaned toward his microphone. Representative Omar, his voice was quiet. It was a Midwest quiet, the kind that does not compete with noise but somehow cuts right through it. It was the way a blade does not have to be loud to be exceptionally sharp. "Thank you. I appreciate the passion," he said, pausing. "I'd like to tell you a story. Actually, I'd like to tell you 2 stories, mine and yours. Because I think when we put them side by side, something interesting happens." "I grew up in Middletown, Ohio," Vance said. The way he said Middletown was the way you say a town's name when it is not just where you are from, but what you are made of. The syllables were worn smooth from a lifetime of carrying them. Population 48,000 and shrinking. "It used to be a steel town. By the time I was growing up, it was a prescription pill town," he stated. He looked out at the Senate chamber, not at Omar, but at the room, at the 100 senators, the aides, and the gallery. "My mother struggled with severe dependency," he explained. Not in the abstract way people use that phrase in policy papers, or regarding a substance crisis, or statistics on a chart. She battled it in the way that means a 13-year-old boy comes home from school and finds her on the bathroom floor. He has to decide whether to call for emergency help or handle it himself, because the last time he called for help, she didn't speak to him for 2 weeks. Silence fell. The Senate chamber, which had just buzzed with Omar's intense attack, went completely flat. "I lived in, and I'm going to be honest because I wrote a book about this so it's not a secret. I lived in a house where there were more medication bottles than food in the refrigerator," Vance shared. "A house where the electricity got shut off 3 times in 1 single year. Where my mother had, and I lost count, 14 boyfriends in 4 years, and each one was a different version of the exact same disaster." Vance's hands rested on the desk. They were flat and open, not gripping and not tense. They were the hands of a man who had made profound peace with his own history. It is the way you make peace with a scar. You do not hide it, and you do not show it off, you just let it be there. "And then my grandmother, Mama, she took me in," he continued. "She was 60 years old, she smoked like a chimney, she kept a loaded personal protective firearm under her mattress, and she saved my life. She didn't save it with a program, and she didn't save it with a government check. She saved it by saying every single day, 'J.D., you are not trash. Don't you ever let anybody tell you that you are?'" He paused, looking down at his hands for a brief moment, and then looked back up. "America gave me that. America gave me Mama. America gave me a recruiting office in Middletown where a Marine sergeant looked at a skinny kid from a troubled home and said, 'You'll do.' It gave me the GI Bill. It gave me Ohio State. It gave me Yale Law School where, yes, Representative, I met my wife. And eventually, America gave me this chair." He looked at Omar. His expression was not confrontational, it was calm, almost gentle. "Now let me tell your story, because it's a good story too," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You were born in Mogadishu in 1982. A severe civil conflict began when you were 8. Your family fled. You didn't relocate. You didn't just immigrate. You fled. It was the kind of fleeing where you leave with only what you can carry, and you don't look back. Because looking back means seeing the things you don't want your children to ever see." He spoke about her past with a specificity that surprised the chamber. He was not attacking or cataloging, he was treating her story with the exact same seriousness that he treated his own. "You spent 4 years in a refugee camp in Kenya. Dadaab. If I'm not mistaken," Vance noted. "I've read about Dadaab. 90,000 people. No running water in most sections. 1 doctor for every 20,000 residents. You were a child. You didn't choose any of it. No child chooses a refugee camp, just like no child chooses a troubled chemical home." The comparison landed in the room, quiet but incredibly heavy. 2 children, 2 nightmares. Same country at the end of both, he stated. "In 1995, the United States of America, this country, the one you just accused me of betraying, admitted your family as refugees, Vance reminded her. Out of every country on earth your family could have gone to, this one said yes. They resettled you in Arlington, Virginia, then Minneapolis. They gave you citizenship. They gave you public schooling, the exact same public schools you now heavily critique. They gave you the right to vote. They gave you the right to run for office, and you won twice. You went from a refugee camp in Kenya to the United States Congress. He let that fact land. He let the arc of it, from a refugee camp to Congress, sit in the chamber the exact way his own arc, from a troubled home to the vice presidency, had sat a moment before. Two arcs, same shape, same country drawing them, he observed. Representative Omar, America gave us both everything. Not perfect everything, not easy everything, not the kind of everything that comes without struggle and failure and days when you wonder if it's worth it, but everything. The question isn't what America gave us. The question is what we gave back. Omar opened her mouth. It was the beginning of a response, a word starting to form, but Vance was not finished. The Senate chamber knew he was not finished because his voice had not risen. A voice that rises is a voice that is reaching for its point, but a voice that stays level already holds the point and is steadily walking toward it. September 11th, 2001. Vance said clearly, I was 17 years old, in my senior year at Middletown High School. He looked at the Senate chamber, and for a moment, his eyes went somewhere that was not this physical room. They went somewhere that was 24 years old and still burning. I remember exactly where I was. Second period, Mrs. Patterson S. English class. Someone came in and said a plane hit the World Trade Center. We went to the cafeteria where they had a TV, and we watched the second plane hit live. 17 years old. I'd never seen anything like it, none of us had. His voice stayed completely level. There was no drama, no tremor, just memory that was as precise as a photograph. The next day, September 12th, 4 of my classmates went to the Marine recruiting office on Main Street, in Middletown, Vance recalled. 4. The very day after the events. They didn't wait for an invasion. They didn't wait for the president to make a speech. They walked in on September 12th and said, "Where do I sign?" One of them, I won't use his name, never came back whole. He's alive, he's in Middletown, he works at a warehouse. But he left a piece of himself during his overseas deployment that he will never get back. Vance looked directly at Omar. That's how Middletown described that September day. We enlisted. He let the sentence hang in the always weighs the rape rate. Representative Omar. In 2019 at a fundraiser, you described that September day as follows. Vance stated. He did not pull out a piece of paper because he did not need to. Everyone in the room already knew the quote. Some people did something. The gallery shifted. It was a sound that was not quite a gasp, and not quite a murmur, but something between the two that moved through the room like a wave passing through tall grass. 3,000 Americans tragically lost their lives, Vance continued. 3,000. Firefighters who ran upstairs knowing they wouldn't come back down. Office workers who called their families from the 90th floor to say their final goodbyes. Passengers on Flight 93 who stormed the cockpit. My friends, kids I grew up with, kids I played football with, joined the United States Marine Corps because of that horrific day. Vance's jaw visibly tightened. It was the only physical tell he had shown, a tightening at the hinge of the jaw. It was the kind of tightening that a man who learned emotional control in a troubled environment and perfected it at Paris Island does not show unless the emotion is deeply real. And your description was something. He paused. He let the words sit in the oak-paneled chamber like a heavy stone dropped into perfectly still water. Some people did something. Those weren't random people, Representative. They were extremist attackers who took the lives of 3,000 Americans. And it wasn't something. It was the worst attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. My friends signed up to fight and put their lives on the line because of that day. Some of them did not return, and you reduced it to something. Omar's chin was still up, and her posture was still absolutely perfect. However, her eyes, for the very first time since she had taken the podium, moved. They did not move away from Vance, but they moved down, just a fraction of a degree. It was the way a compass needle drifts when a strong magnet passes nearby. It was not enough to change direction, but it was enough to prove that the needle truly felt it. Let me be honest about something, Vance said. The phrase was a signature of his. It was not a throat clearing, but rather a warning label in the Vance universe. "Let me be honest about something," was the distinct sound of the safety coming off. "When I wrote Hillbilly Elegy, I got heavily criticized. You know who criticized me the most? People from my very own community, people from Middletown, people from Appalachia. They said ID aired dirty laundry. They said ID made them look bad. They said ID told the world that my mother battled dependency, that my family was broken, and that our town was dying." He nodded slowly. "And they were right. I did tell the world that, because it was true, and I believed, and I still believe, that the only way to fix a profound problem is to be honest about it, not to cover it up, not to blame the investigators, but to say, this is broken, and here's how, and here is exactly what it costs." He turned his focus back to Omar. "Representative, your community, the Somali-American community in Minneapolis, had a problem too. A very big one." He did not raise his voice, and he did not lean forward. He stayed exactly where he was, holding the posture of a man who does not need to move toward you, because the established facts are already walking in your direction. "Feeding Our Future, a federal nutrition program," Vance detailed. "Between 2020 and 2022, over $250 million, and potentially as high as $9 billion depending on which federal estimate you choose to accept, was misappropriated. It was taken from a program specifically designed to feed vulnerable children. 75 defendants were charged in what became the largest pandemic financial misconduct case in American history." He let the massive numbers land before adding more. "Let me tell you what $250 million in diverted child nutrition money actually looks like on the other end," he explained. "It looks like a feeding site on Riverside Avenue that listed 5,000 meals served per day. Investigators visited. You know how many children were present? None. 0 children. 5,000 meals claimed. 0 mouths fed. The money went to luxury cars, real estate in Kenya and Turkey, and a $4 million property portfolio for one of the key defendants. Luxury condos were bought with money that was supposed to buy lunch for a 7-year-old. Vance paused. The Senate chamber was completely still. "And these weren't strangers to your district, Representative. These were organizations located right in the 5th District. Your district, your constituents ran these sites. Your constituents reported the financial misconduct. And when the investigation finally came, when law enforcement showed up to find out why feeding sites with 0 children were billing for thousands of meals, you went on the record." He looked at Omar, and she looked back. Her face had not moved. She held the deep composure of a woman who had been through congressional censures and successfully survived. But her right hand left the podium and dropped to her side. It was not a retreat, but a rebalancing. It was the kind of physical adjustment a person makes when the solid ground shifts beneath them. "And what did you do, Representative, when investigators came to Minneapolis to uncover how $250 million meant for hungry children was diverted?" Vance asked. "When the FBI and DOJ opened cases, you called the investigation chaos. Your word, chaos. You didn't call the massive misconduct chaos, you called the investigation chaos. You said the government was criminalizing community organizations. These were the very organizations that were billing for children who simply didn't exist." Vance shook his head. It was not dramatic, just the slow headshake of a man who could not understand the skewed math. "When my community had problems, real problems, ugly problems, the kind you desperately don't want on the front page, I wrote about them honestly. It cost me friendships. It cost me family Thanksgivings. There are people back in Middletown who still won't even look at me, but I told the truth, because the people suffering from those problems, the kids in troubled homes, the families losing fathers to dangerous substances, they deserve the truth far more than I ever deserved comfort." He paused again. "When your community had the exact same kind of problem, people stealing from children, you covered for it. You attacked the people trying to stop it. And the children who were supposed to be fed? They were still hungry." Omar shifted her weight from her left foot to her right foot. It was the shift of a debater recalculating their position. She was not retreating, but she was recognizing that the ground she was standing on had fundamentally changed. Her aide, a young man in a gray suit, sitting 2 rows behind the podium, was writing something on a notepad extremely fast. They were not notes for her, but notes for himself. In Washington, aides write 2 kinds of notes: notes that help their boss, and notes that protect their own career. This was definitely the second kind. Representative Omar, let me be honest about something else, Vance stated. There it was again, the safety coming off. The Senate chamber, which had clearly learned the pattern, mentally braced itself. I made my money writing a book, Hillbilly Elegy. I wrote it, a publisher bought it, and people read it. Some agreed, some hated it. But the transaction was exceptionally clean. Book for money. Completely transparent. My tax returns are public. He paused. After the book, I worked in venture capital. I invested in companies. Some worked out, some didn't. The salary was public, and the investments were thoroughly disclosed. When I ran for Senate, I filed every single financial disclosure required by law. Every one. He looked directly at Omar. Let's talk about your money, Representative. Omar's chin lifted a fraction higher. It was barely visible, but it was the tell. It was the Omar tell. When the chin goes up, the armor firmly goes on. Your campaign, your official FEC-registered campaign, paid $3.7 million to the E Street Group, a consulting firm, Vance explained. The founder and managing partner of the E Street Group is Tim Minette. He paused. Tim Minette is your husband. The gallery did not react out loud. They already knew, as everyone in Washington knew. But hearing it laid out on the Senate floor in Vance's flat Midwest voice was completely different from reading it in a Politico article. Articles are abstract, but a man's voice is concrete. $3.7 million in campaign funds routed through your husband's company, Vance continued. The FEC filed a formal complaint. Your campaign amended its filings after the fact. The amended filings showed payments that the original filings did not show. This means the original filings were either entirely wrong or incomplete. In either case, Representative, that's a serious problem. He let that fact settle before continuing. And it's not just the campaign money. Mr. Minette's other business ventures, a cannabis company, a winery venture, consulting contracts outside the campaign, have generated their very own questions. There is $1.7 million in funds that journalists have deeply struggled to trace from input to output. When you remarried to someone whose company receives millions from your campaign and whose other businesses have unaccounted money, Representative, the word for that isn't entrepreneurship. The word is pattern. Vance did not wait for a response. He turned a page in a thin folder, which was the only prop he had used. It was a plain manila folder with no labels and no dramatic colored tabs. And then there's the immigration question, which I bring up not to be cruel, but because you raised the specific topic of immigration in your attack on me, he said, looking at her. There are credible, documented allegations, investigated by the Minneapolis Star-Tribune and reviewed by multiple federal agencies, that you married your brother Ahmed Nursaid Elmi in 2009 for the explicit purpose of immigration misconduct. You vehemently denied it. But the records that could definitively prove or disprove it, your 2009 tax returns, you fully refused to release. And when Congresswoman Nancy Mace issued a subpoena for those specific records in 2025, you challenged it in court. He closed the folder gently. The way you close a book you have just finished reading. I made my money writing about my pain. You made yours routing campaign funds through your husband's company. I disclosed absolutely everything. You amended your filings only after you got caught. That's the difference. Omar's hand, the one that had left the podium, was now resting at her hip. Her fingers curled against the fabric of her jacket. It was not a fist, but not open either. It was something in between. It was the hand of a person who desperately wants to gesture, but simply does not know what the gesture would even be. Vance leaned back in the presiding officer's chair. For the first time in 20 minutes, something in his posture changed. He did not get harder, he got softer. The data knife was effectively being put down. What came next was not data, it was something much older. Representative Omar, I want to tell you something very personal. I hope you'll actually hear it. His voice dropped. It did not drop to a whisper, but to the specific register a man uses when he is speaking to one single person in a room completely full of people. It was the register of an intimate conversation, not a speech. I wake up every single day grateful, Vance stated. Every day. Not grateful in the cliché way politicians say they regrateful. I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve. That kind of stuff. The stuff that means absolutely nothing. I mean genuinely, deeply grateful. The kind of grateful where you lie in bed at 5:00 a.m. before the alarm goes off and you think about Mama, who's gone now, and you say thank you out loud to a woman who can't even hear you. The Senate chamber was utterly still. It was not the stillness of people waiting for a punchline, it was the stillness of people listening to something remarkably true. I'm grateful to the Marine sergeant who yelled at me for 16 weeks at boot camp until I stopped being a scared kid from Ohio and started being a real man, Vance continued. I'm grateful to my wife, who saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. I'm grateful to the teachers at Middletown High who didn't give up on me when my grades plummeted every time my mom had a new boyfriend. He looked at Omar, and his face, which had been calm and precise for 20 straight minutes, showed something else. It was not anger, and it was not triumph. It was sadness. I'm grateful to America, Vance declared. Not to an abstract idea of America, not to a theory of America. I am grateful to this actual country, with its actual flaws and its actual beauty, that took a kid from a troubled chemical home and let him become the vice president. That's what I gave back gratitude, every single day. He paused for a long time. Representative Omar, the exact same country that took you from a refugee camp in Kenya and gave you citizenship and a seat in the United States Congress. That country, the same country that took me from a troubled home and gave me the Marines, and this chair. That country. He leaned intently toward the microphone. When was the last time you said something genuinely kind about it? The profound question landed in the Senate chamber like a heavy bell struck in an empty church. It was a single, clear tone that just kept resonating. Not qualified, not conditional, not America is great, but just kind. When was the last time you stood at a podium and said something kind about the country that literally saved your life? Omar stood frozen at the podium, her mouth opened, but not wide, just the very beginning of a word. But a word simply did not come. This was because the question was not about complex policy. It was not about voting records, or FEC filings, or immigration issues, or $250 million diverted from hungry children. The question was about one single word, when, and she could not name a time. 1 second passed, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4. The Senate chamber counted the time without verbally counting. Every person in the room felt the heavy seconds in their chest. It is the way you feel seconds stretch when someone is expected to speak and simply doesn't. Each second was stretching, thickening, and becoming heavier than the second before it. 5 seconds. 6. 7. Omar's aide completely stopped writing. The notepad sat motionless on his lap, and his pen was entirely still. 8 seconds. 9. Vance did not fill the immense silence. He did not rescue her, and he did not move on. He just sat firmly in the presiding officer's chair and waited. He waited the way you wait for an answer to a question that truly matters. He waited not impatiently and not aggressively, but with the deep patience of a man who had waited his whole life for things that mattered, and who had learned that waiting is never weakness. 10 seconds. Omar's chin, the chin that never ever dropped, did not drop, but it definitively stopped lifting. It found a resting position that was neither defiant nor defeated. It was a position that had absolutely no name, because it was the position of a person who had been asked a remarkably simple question and found, within the vast catalog of her entire political career, no answer. I say it every day, Vance said softly. I say thank you. I say it to the Marines who trained me. I say it to the teachers who believed in me. I say it to Mama, who's gone now but who I still talk to anyway. And I say it to this country. He looked out at the chamber and then focused back at Omar. When was the last time you said thank you, Representative? Not to your donors, not to CARE, but to America, the country that saved both of us. He paused, then spoke even quieter. Because here is what I hear from you, Representative. I hear it's all about the Benjamins, baby, regarding our closest ally in the Middle East. I hear dual loyalty, an accusation so old and so incredibly ugly that your own political party condemned it. I hear some people did something about the worst day in our nation's modern history. I hear you describe protesters celebrating the October events as students who are merely fighting for the right thing. I hear you get removed from the Foreign Affairs Committee by a bipartisan vote because your colleagues on both sides of the aisle decided they simply couldn't trust you to represent America's interests abroad. His voice had not risen once, not by a single decibel, and that was exactly what made it devastating. The brutal facts were coming at room temperature, and room temperature was more than enough to burn. That's your record of gratitude, Representative. That is exactly what you gave back to the country that saved your life. Benjamins, dual loyalty, something, and an empty 10 seconds of silence when someone simply asked you to say something kind. Silence. Vance waited 3 more seconds, then nodded. It was the nod of a man who had finally received his answer, and the answer was the complete absence of one. Vance stood up slowly. The presiding officer standing at the dais is highly unusual, as the VP typically remains securely seated. But this was no longer a typical session, and Vance standing was not a power move. It was a definitive closing. It was the way a man stands at the end of a conversation that deeply mattered. Representative Omar, we are both children of the American dream. His voice was steady. The Midwest quiet had finally settled into something much deeper now. It was not quiet as an absence, but quiet as significant weight. Both of us. You from a war zone, me from a troubled environment. 2 kids who logically shouldn't have made it. 2 kids who miraculously did. He looked intensely at her. The difference is not that I'm a Republican, and you are a Democrat. I truly don't care about that right now. The profound difference is this: I know the dream is real. I lived it. I know it's imperfect, and I know it doesn't work for everyone. I know there are kids right now in Middletown going through exactly what I went through, and some of them won't make it. But the dream is real. It happened to me, and I am living proof that it happened. His jaw tightened once again. That distinct hinge tightening, and this time he let it show. He let the camera clearly see it, because what came next was not political in nature. You've spent your entire career pretending the dream doesn't exist, he stated. Because if the dream is real, if America really can take a struggling refugee from Somalia and make her a powerful congresswoman, then your grievance narrative completely falls apart. If America is actually good enough to do that, then all the anger, all the some people did something, all the ITS, all about the Benjamins, all of it immediately stops working. Because you can be a perpetual victim of the very country that saved you. You can only be ungrateful. Omar's eyes moved rapidly. They did not move down this time, but toward the exit. It was just a quick glance, a flash so quick that only the aides sitting at the specific angle between the podium and the door would have noticed it. It was the very first time in the entire exchange that her body had betrayed a direction, and the direction was emphatically out. She did not physically move toward it, but she looked. I'm grateful, Representative. You are just angry. Vance's voice was the softest it had been all session. It was not condescending, and it was not pitying. It was the profound softness of a man who recognized something in someone else that he had seen in his own mother. It is the anger that stems from deep pain that never got thanked away, that never got loved away, but just sat there and slowly turned into politics. And the saddest part of all is we were both saved by the exact same country. He sat down. The gavel, which had been resting untouched for the entire exchange because absolutely no one had thought to use it, and no one had wanted to interrupt, sat on the presiding officer's desk like a forgotten prop from a play that had gone entirely off script. The session was technically still active. The immigration reform discussion was technically still on the agenda. But everyone in the chamber knew that whatever came next, whatever amendment, whatever vote, whatever procedural motion, would be a mere afterthought. The session was effectively over. Vance had ended it the exact way a man ends a conversation, by saying the truest possible thing in the room and then sitting back down. The Senate chamber did not erupt in applause. The Senate simply doesn't applaud. It is strictly against decorum, against tradition, and against everything the oak panels and marble floors were built to enforce. But something happened that was significantly louder than applause. Senators shifted in their seats. It was not an uncomfortable shift, but a decisive one. It was the shift of people who had just firmly made up their minds about something they had previously been undecided on. It was the shift of people who had watched a man answer a direct insult, not with another insult, but with a question. And that specific question had been the strongest blow anyone had landed on that entire floor all year long. Omar stood at the podium for 4 more seconds. Her papers were already gathered in her hands. She had begun collecting them during Vance's final paragraph, acting the way a student collects books before the school bell officially rings, the body already leaving before the feet actually follow. She straightened the loose papers against the podium edge. Tap, tap, 2 taps, precise and controlled. It was the precision of a woman who needed her hands to do something entirely normal, because the rest of her was doing something she had never experienced before losing a massive confrontation without speaking a single word. She walked back to the visitors' gallery entrance. Her back was straight, her headscarf was firmly in place, and her chin was at the exact same angle it had been since she arrived. But the walk itself was entirely different. It was not the walk of a woman who had come to the Senate to confidently deliver a message. It was the walk of a woman who had come to the Senate to deliver a message and had instead been asked a question. And the question was still hanging heavily in the air right behind her. It followed her through the door, followed her into the hallway, and followed her into the waiting car that would take her back to the House side of the Capitol. There, she would sit in her office and be aggressively asked by 17 reporters, one after another, the exact same question Vance had asked her, when was the last time. She would not answer them either. The clip hit Twitter before Omar even reached the hallway. It was not the full exchange, because nobody watches 22 minutes of footage on Twitter. It was just the clip. The clip was exactly 63 seconds long. It started precisely at, "When was the last time you said something genuinely kind about it?" and ended at, "The country that saved both of us." 63 seconds, featuring 10 solid seconds of silence right in the middle. It was those 10 seconds that fundamentally broke the internet. Omar's silence trended #1 within 90 minutes. It gathered 28 million views in merely 4 hours. The clip did not need any commentary, because the silence was the commentary. 10 seconds of a United States Congresswoman standing at a podium, her mouth slightly open, utterly unable to name a single time she had said something kind about the nation that gave her citizenship. Fox News ran the entire full exchange uncut during their 8:00 p.m. hour. This was something they almost never did, because uncut footage lacks the flashy graphics, the chyrons, and the 4-person panels that keep viewers from changing the channel. But the network producers understood that this specific footage didn't need any graphics. The raw footage was the graphic. CNN's coverage was incredibly revealing. Anderson Cooper played the "When was the last time" clip and turned to his assembled panel. The panelist on the left, a former Obama communications director, began with, "Representative Omar has repeatedly expressed," and then immediately stopped. She looked frantically at her notes and shuffled her papers. "She has expressed," she has said, and the sentence simply never finished. The panelist had gone desperately looking for the quote where Omar said something kind about America, unqualified and unconditional. And the quote was simply not there. The two refugees framing rapidly became the central story. It was not Vance versus Omar, or Republican versus Democrat. It was two people, saved by the very same country. One said, "Thank you." One couldn't name the last time. That specific framing was devastating because it was completely immune to standard political counterattacks. You couldn't call it racist because Vance had explicitly honored Omar's profound refugee story. You couldn't call it sexist, as he hadn't mentioned gender once. You couldn't call it Islamophobic, because he hadn't mentioned religion at all. All you could call it was the absolute truth. And the truth had sat heavily in the Senate chamber for 10 whole seconds, with absolutely no response. Consequences followed swiftly. Omar's office released a formal statement 3 hours after the exchange. Vice President Vance's attempt to weaponize patriotism is a dangerous distraction from the real threats facing immigrant communities. The statement intentionally used the word dangerous twice, distraction 3 times, and America exactly 0 times. Political Twitter immediately noticed. "She had 3 hours to say something nice about America," one viral tweet read. "She used them to say dangerous and distraction instead." Vance's point was proven. CARE called the exchange a dog whistle wrapped up in a personal story. This response generated a huge second wave of viral clips, this time featuring Vance supporters posting the "I am grateful to the Marines who trained me" section right alongside CARE's statement, asking viewers, which one sounds like a dog whistle to you? The FEC complaint regarding the E Street Group payments gained massive new momentum. 3 senators, 2 Republican and 1 independent, co-signed a letter, officially requesting formal review. Tim Mynette's firm strategically suspended its contract with the Omar campaign pending that review. The Mace subpoena on Omar's 2009 tax records finally moved to federal court in D.C., with a hearing officially scheduled for July. But the lasting damage was not legal, it was entirely narrative. Two refugees became a cultural phrase. It appeared on bumper stickers, in prominent op-eds, and in Sunday sermons. It became the shorthand for a very specific idea that America is not measured by the people who complain about it, but by the people who were truly saved by it and confidently say so. A pastor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a Congolese refugee who had come to America in 1998, used two refugees as his sermon title the very next Sunday. He told his congregation, "I know exactly which refugee I am. Do you?" The sermon was recorded on a cell phone, posted to YouTube, and quickly got 4 million views. A man in Tulsa speaking to merely 60 people in a church basement reached significantly more people than Omar had reached in her entire attack on Vance. A high school teacher in Dearborn, Michigan, an Arab American with 20 years in the classroom, assigned the full exchange as a critical civics exercise. Watch both sides, she instructed her students, then answer one simple question. Can you name the last time you said something kind about America? 14 of her 22 students easily could. The other 8 sat quietly and thought deeply about it. The teacher later told the Detroit Free Press, "That silence was the most incredibly productive silence I've had in 20 years of teaching." The when was the last time question became its very own meme, but not the mocking kind, it was the sincere kind. People posted videos of themselves thoughtfully answering it. A truck driver in Laredo, a nail salon owner in Houston, and a retired Marine in Jacksonville, all posted. A Somali-American nurse in Columbus, Ohio, looked directly at the camera and said, "Yesterday, I said thank you. Yesterday, when my patient miraculously survived surgery and the medical system worked, I said thank you to America yesterday." That single clip alone got 11 million views. Tyler Boggs sat on the front steps of his duplex on Crawford Street, just 3 blocks from where J.D. Vance actually grew up. He was 7 blocks from the Marine recruiting office where Tyler had walked in on September 12, 2001. He had been 17 years old, not old enough to sign without a parent, and completely unwilling to wait for one. Tyler was 41 now. He worked the second shift at a logistics warehouse right outside Middletown, making $19.40 an hour. He had bad knees from his overseas deployment, but good enough hands to consistently stack heavy pallets. He watched the Vance clip on his phone, not propped against anything, just firmly held in his hand. Tyler wasn't the kind of man who meticulously set up viewing stations. He watched things once, standing up, and then immediately went back to work. Vance said, "4 of my classmates went to the Marine recruiting office on Main Street." Tyler immediately paused the clip. He looked up at Crawford Street. It was quiet, with a broken sidewalk, 2 boarded houses on the corner, and 1 kid riding a bicycle. Same street, different decade, same town. He pressed play. Vance said, "One of them never came back whole." Tyler looked down at his knees. The left one was the one that had taken severe injury during his deployment. It was the one that predicted incoming rain better than any weather app, and the one that made the stairs at the warehouse a grueling daily negotiation. The left one ached. It always ached whenever someone talked about his deployment, not phantom pain, but deep memory pain. It was the body remembering exactly what the mind had desperately filed away. J.D. said it right. Tyler quietly said to no one. Or perhaps to the street. Or to the kid on the bicycle. Or to the 4 brave guys from Middletown High who walked into that recruiting office in 2001, 3 of whom were still alive, and 1 of whom was Tyler, and 1 of whom wasn't, too. We joined because of that specific day. She called it something. He closed the clip, slid the phone back in his pocket, and stood up slow because the left knee always needed warning. He went inside. On the kitchen counter, resting next to a gas bill and a half-eaten sleeve of Ritz crackers, there was a framed photo. It was Tyler at 18, at Paris Island in dress blues, grinning. It was the grin of a kid who didn't know what deployment was yet, but who had walked into a recruiting office the exact day after 3,000 Americans died. Because that's what you did in Middletown when a tragedy happened. Not just something. That profound thing. The thing that permanently changed everything. Tyler looked at the photo, gently touched the frame once, and went to work. Abdi Farah wiped the counter of his convenience store on Cedar Avenue in Minneapolis. It was the avenue the locals called Little Mogadishu, the avenue where the signs were proudly in English and Somali, and the shelves held both Campbell's soup and camel milk. It was 6:15 p.m., and the afterwork rush was noticeably thinning. A small TV behind the register, securely mounted in 2014, the same exact year Abdi bought the store, was playing the Vance clip. Abdi's nephew, Youssef, had pulled it up on his smartphone and cast it directly to the TV. Youssef was 22 and fiercely believed that everything important happened on a screen, and everything on a screen should absolutely be on a bigger screen. Vance's clear voice filled the small store. "When was the last time you said something genuinely kind about it?" Abdi immediately stopped wiping, rag still in hand, and stared at the TV. He had been in America for 23 years. He had arrived in 2002, not from a refugee camp, but from Nairobi, where he'd spent 6 years after fleeing Mogadishu. He had worked incredibly hard at a meat processing plant in Faribault for 3 years, saved up $14,000, moved to Minneapolis, and finally bought the store with an SBA loan and 3 years of paralyzing fear. 23 years. In that time, he had successfully paid off the loan, put 2 beautiful daughters through community college, and buried his father, who had made it to Minneapolis but tragically not to the 10th anniversary of their arrival. He survived an armed robbery in 2017, survived COVID in 2020, and survived the massive financial scandal. The scandal didn't touch his store, but it deeply touched his neighborhood's reputation, which unfortunately touched everything. Abdi looked at the TV. Then, he looked up at the sign above his door. It was the sign Diab had custom-made in 2014, when the store was brand new. The neighborhood was undeniably hard, and Abdi wanted absolutely everyone who walked in to know exactly what kind of place this was. The sign was printed in English and Somali. It said one simple word, "Welcome." "Every day," Abdi said quietly. He spoke so quietly that Youssef, diligently restocking shelves just 3 feet away, didn't even hear him. "I say thank you every single day." He looked back at the TV, watching Omar standing at the podium through the 10 seconds of silence. "She should try it," he murmured. Youssef looked up. "What?" Abdi shook his head and simply went back to wiping the counter. The rag moved in deliberate, slow circles. It was the exact same motion he'd been making for 11 years. It was the motion of a proud man who cleaned his very own store, because the store was his. And what is yours, you take proper care of. And what takes care of you, you gratefully say thank you to. Outside, Cedar Avenue was slowly settling into evening. The halal butcher was closing up. The tea shop was quickly filling with customers. A woman in a headscarf was pushing a stroller, and a man in a Vikings jersey was laughing warmly with his son. Cedar Avenue, Little Mogadishu, doing what it had always done, being deeply American in its very own way. It was the way Middletown was American in its own distinct way. It was the way every single town that generously takes someone in and lets them build something is fundamentally American. Abdi looked up at the sign one more time. "Welcome," that was his heartfelt thank you, every single day, right there on the front door. She called him a hypocrite, and he told her about Mama. She called him a prop, and he told her about September 12, 2001. She heavily attacked the latter, and he simply asked her when she last said, "Thank you." God bless Tyler Boggs and the 4 brave boys from Middletown who walked into a recruiting office the exact day after the world permanently changed, because something wasn't a word they ever used. God bless Abdi Farah and the sign that proudly says, "Welcome," because a man who wipes his own counter and says thank you every single day taught this country more about genuine gratitude than 1,000 speeches from a prominent podium ever could. 2 refugees, the same country. One said thank you, one couldn't. 24 excuses from one congresswoman, 10 crushing seconds of silence, and one singular question she still hasn't answered. When was the very last time you said something truly kind about America?